October 14, 1943. Schweinfurt, Germany. 60 American bombers are on fire. Not damaged. Not limping home. On fire. Spinning. Falling. 229 men are dying in real time, and the men watching from the surviving aircraft can do nothing but hold formation and pray they are not next. The sky is black with flak bursts and burning aluminum. A B-17 directly ahead simply ceases to exist, replaced by a fireball that expands and vanishes in 3 seconds. The crew inside 10 men, 10 sons, 10 futures are gone before anyone can blink. This is not a bad day. This is the mathematical destruction of an entire strategy. And somewhere below, watching through binoculars from a German airfield, a Luftwaffe ace is laughing. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. This community is built for people who refuse to forget what shaped our world. His name was Hans Eckhard Bob, 26 years old, 40 victories to his credit, and he had fought since the first day of the war. He wasn't cruel. He was simply confident. Because he had seen this before. The Americans came in their great silver formations brave beyond reason, and they died beyond reason too. The escorts always left. The gap always opened. And then the Focke-Wulfs rose to do what they were built to do. He had no reason to fear. He had every reason to laugh. And he did. What he could not know, what no German ace could imagine on that October afternoon, was that somewhere in a factory in California, an answer was already being built. An answer that would, within 6 months, put 200 of Germany's finest pilots in burning spirals over Berlin. An answer that everyone in authority had already rejected as a failure. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what the air war over Europe actually looked like by late 1943. Because the official version, the clean version with heroes and victories, and inevitable triumph, was not the version the bomber crews were living. The version they were living was a nightmare measured in percentages. A full combat tour was 25 missions. Statistical analysis, the cold arithmetic of loss rates, said that if you were flying bombers in the 8th Air Force in 1943, you had roughly a 1 in 4 chance of surviving all 25. Men did that math quietly alone, usually at night before the next mission briefing. They did not share their conclusions. They knew the conclusions. The problem was not courage. American bomber crews had courage in quantities that defied description. They flew straight and level into walls of flak because deviating would ruin the bomb run. They held formation while aircraft on either side exploded because breaking formation meant death for everyone else. They did this day after day, mission after mission, knowing the odds, accepting the odds, climbing into their aircraft anyway. The problem was physics. A bomber flying straight and level at 25,000 feet with no fighter escort was not a weapon. It was a target. And the Luftwaffe had spent 4 years perfecting what to do with targets. The American planners had believed in daylight precision bombing with religious intensity. The theory was sound fly in tight formation. Use the Norden bomb site, hit the factories and the oil refineries and the ball-bearing plants with surgical precision, and Germany's ability to wage war would collapse. It was elegant. It was logical. It was being destroyed by one single variable no one had adequately solved. Range. The escorts couldn't go far enough. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a magnificent machine, nearly indestructible, beloved by the pilots who flew it. But it was a fuel hog. It could protect the bombers for the first 150 miles or so, and then the gauges told the truth and the pilots turned for home. The P-38 Lightning could go a little farther, but it had its own problems at altitude, and it was never available in sufficient numbers to make the difference. So the bombers flew on alone. Every crew knew the moment. They called it the gap of death, the stretch of sky where the escorts were gone and Germany's fighters were waiting. The Luftwaffe didn't scramble in a panic when the American formations appeared. They were patient, organized, professional. They tracked the formations on radar, calculated the moment the escorts would have to turn back, and then they gathered their strength and they waited. When the escorts left, what rose to meet the bombers wasn't chaos. It was a wall. Formations of Focke-Wulf 19s and Messerschmitt 109s. Sometimes 100 fighters at once, attacking in coordinated waves, coming head-on to negate the defensive fire from the bombers' gunners. The closing speed was nearly 600 miles per hour. No human reflex could track it. No gunner could react in time. They fired blind and hoped. The Germans fired with precision and knew. During Black Week in October 1943, the numbers became impossible to defend. 60 bombers lost in a single day over Schweinfurt. 600 men in one afternoon. The commanders filed their reports. The newspapers printed what they were allowed to print. And the men kept climbing into their aircraft because there was nothing else to do. But the strategy was dying. Everyone who was paying honest attention could see it. Daylight strategic bombing was eating the 8th Air Force alive, and unless something changed, there would not be enough crews left to matter. The solution, every engineer and commander agreed, was a long-range fighter escort. A plane that could fly with the bombers all the way to the target and back, that could fight at altitude, that could outrun and outclimb and outgun the Luftwaffe's best. Simple. Obvious. And according to every calculation anyone had run, impossible. You could have a fast, nimble dogfighter. Or you could have a long-range heavy aircraft with enough fuel to go the distance. You could not have both. Weight was the enemy. Fuel weighed a tremendous amount, and a plane heavy with fuel couldn't maneuver the way a fighter needed to maneuver. The Germans knew this. The British knew this. The Americans knew this. It was one of the accepted limits of the war, a wall that physics had built, and no one was going to knock it down. But there was already a plane sitting in a hangar that no one was looking at properly. His name was Ronnie Harker, and he was not a general. He was not a program director or a procurement officer or anyone with the authority to change the direction of a war. He was a test pilot 30 years old, employed by Rolls-Royce to fly aircraft and report what he found. In April of 1942, Harker climbed into an early model P-51 Mustang for the first time, and the moment he was airborne, he felt something that the official reports had missed entirely. The aircraft was extraordinary. The handling was precise and responsive in ways that no fighter he had flown before could match. The laminar flow wing, a revolutionary design that allowed air to pass over its surface with far less drag than conventional wings, gave the Mustang an efficiency that was almost shocking. It flew smooth and fast and felt, in Harker's words, like nothing else in the sky. And then he pushed it above 15,000 feet, and the truth hit him like a fist. The Allison engine began to die. Not mechanically. It simply suffocated. The single-stage supercharger could not feed enough air into the engine at that altitude, and a fighter that cannot breathe at altitude is not a fighter. It is a coffin with wings. The Americans had already figured this out. They'd sent the Mustang to reconnaissance work and ground attack useful things, secondary things, nowhere near the altitudes where the bombers flew, and the real war was being decided. The program was going nowhere. Everyone agreed it was a dead end. Harker landed and sat down and wrote a memo that was short enough to fit on a single page, and that single page would save more lives than any other document produced during the entire war. He wrote 3 sentences that mattered. The Mustang was one of the finest airframes he had ever flown. The Allison engine was strangling it. Put a Rolls-Royce Merlin inside it. The Merlin engine was not just better than the Allison, it was in a different category of existence. It had been designed from the beginning to operate in the thin, frozen air above 30,000 feet. Its 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger was a mechanical miracle, a system that compressed the air before feeding it into the engine in a way that kept performance high, even as the atmosphere became too thin to breathe. The Merlin was what powered the Spitfire. It was what had won the Battle of Britain. It was the finest high-altitude piston engine on the planet. The idea of putting it into the Mustang airframe was either genius or insanity. And the line between those two things was very thin. The technical problems alone were enough to make experienced engineers walk away shaking their heads. The two engines were different sizes, different shapes, different cooling requirements. The Merlin ran on a different coolant system. The engine mounts were incompatible. The propeller shaft sat at a different angle. Installing a Merlin into a P-51 wasn't a swap. It was effectively a redesign of the entire front half of the aircraft, and if it disrupted the Mustang's center of gravity or disturbed the airflow over that perfect laminar wing, the whole thing was ruined. You would have destroyed the best airframe in the inventory by forcing an incompatible engine into it. Harker's superiors read the memo. Some of them nodded politely. Some of them explained carefully why it wouldn't work. The technical obstacles were real. The time was short. The resources were needed elsewhere. There were 100 good reasons to say no. There was one reason to say yes. People were dying at a rate that could not continue. Rolls-Royce engineers working with North American Aviation's team in California tore apart 5 Mustangs and began forcing the Merlin inside. Nights blurred into days. Parts were machined from scratch. Mounts were rebuilt from the ground up. Radiators were relocated, rerouted, redesigned. The men doing this work understood what was at stake because they had brothers and friends flying the missions that were failing. They were not working on a contract. They were working on something that felt in the workshops at 3 in the morning, with metal shavings on the floor and coffee gone cold, like the only thing that mattered. In November of 1942, the first prototype was ready. Nobody slept the night before the test flight. When the pilot climbed in and taxied to the runway, the men who had built it stood and watched and did not speak. The engine turned over. The aircraft rolled forward. It lifted into the gray English morning and kept climbing past 15,000 feet where the Allison had gasped and died, past 20,000, past 25,000. And at 30,000 feet, the altitude where the bombers were being slaughtered, the new Mustang was not struggling. It was accelerating. The numbers from that first test flight changed everything. At altitude, the Merlin-powered Mustang was nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the Allison version. It outclimbed every fighter the Allies had. Its handling at altitude was as precise and responsive as it had been at low level. It was not just improved, it was transformed. The German aces were still laughing. They still believed the Mustang was a mediocre reconnaissance aircraft that posed no serious threat. They had made in the autumn of 1942 the most expensive mistake of the entire war. And the clock was already running. In Part 2, the Mustang reaches England, and the German pilots are about to discover what it means to be hunted. In Part 1, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronnie Harker climbed into a P-51 Mustang, felt something extraordinary in the airframe, and wrote a memo that should have changed history immediately. Engineers tore 5 Mustangs apart and forced a Merlin engine inside. The prototype flew. At 30,000 feet, it was nearly 100 miles per hour, faster than anything the Luftwaffe expected. The aircraft that everyone had written off as a dead end had just been resurrected. But a successful test flight in England meant nothing if the men with stars on their shoulders refused to believe it. And in the winter of 1942, most of them did not believe it at all. Here is the number no one wanted to say out loud. The 8th Air Force needed at minimum 500 long-range escort fighters operational and in theater to meaningfully protect its bomber formations over Germany. 500. In December of 1942, the total number of Merlin-powered Mustangs that existed anywhere on Earth was 5, and the generals who controlled the procurement pipeline had already decided the program was a distraction. Brigadier General Haywood Hansell was not a villain. He was a careful man, a planner, someone who had spent years developing the doctrine of daylight precision bombing and believed in it with the conviction of a man who had staked his career on a single idea. When the reports from the Merlin Mustang prototype tests landed on his desk in early 1943, he read them. He set them down. And he said something that would echo through every bureaucratic obstruction that followed. We already have the Thunderbolt. We already have the Lightning. Adding a third aircraft type to the logistics chain creates complexity we cannot afford. He was not wrong about the logistics. He was catastrophically wrong about everything else. The men making the case for the Mustang were not generals. They were engineers and test pilots, and a handful of junior officers who had looked at the data and understood what it meant. They were not the kind of people Hansel was accustomed to listening to. At a briefing in February of 1943, one of those junior officers, a 28-year-old from Ohio named Thomas Hitchcock, who served as assistant air attaché in London, stood up in a room full of senior officers and said what no one with rank was willing to say. "General, with respect, the current loss rate is not sustainable. We are losing crews faster than we can train replacements. The Thunderbolt cannot solve this problem. The Mustang can. The numbers are on the table." Hansel looked at him the way senior officers look at junior officers who have forgotten their place. "Son," he said, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but enthusiasm is not a logistics plan." Hitchcock sat down. The briefing ended. Nothing changed. Outside, over the frozen skies of Germany, men continued to die at the rate the numbers predicted. What Hansel did not know, and would not know until it was too late to matter, was that Hitchcock did not go home after that meeting and accept defeat. He went back to his office and started writing letters. Specific letters to specific people with specific data attached. He had learned something from the briefing. The men who controlled decisions in this war did not respond to passion. They responded to numbers and to the right name at the bottom of a page. He needed an ally with enough authority to make the numbers impossible to ignore. He found one in a place no one expected. General Henry Hap Arnold. Chief of the Army Air Forces, was not a man given to sentiment. He had built the American Air Arm from almost nothing into a force of staggering size, and he had done it by being ruthless about what worked and pitiless about what didn't. He had been receiving the loss reports. He had been reading the summaries. And unlike Hansel, he had not built his identity around a single doctrine. When Hitchcock's letter reached him, attached to a performance comparison that showed the Merlin Mustang outrunning a Focke-Wulf 190 at altitude by a margin that looked like a misprint, Arnold read it twice. Then he picked up a telephone. The call that followed did not go through normal channels. It did not need to. Arnold told the relevant commanders that the Merlin-powered P-51 program would receive full priority. Not a test batch. Not a limited evaluation. Full priority. Hansel's objections did not disappear. They simply stopped mattering. But getting Arnold's approval was not the end of the obstacle. It was the beginning of a different one, and in many ways a harder one, because now the men who had to be convinced were not bureaucrats in offices. They were combat veterans who had survived by trusting what they knew, and what they knew was that no single-engine fighter had ever escorted bombers to Berlin and back. They had watched escort fighters leave. They had counted the ones that didn't return. They were not going to trust a plane they had never seen do what they had been told was impossible until it did it in front of their eyes. The demonstration was scheduled for December of 1943 at Leiston Airfield in Suffolk, where the 357th Fighter Group had just received their first P-51Bs. The weather on the morning of the demonstration was the kind of English winter weather that makes men question their choices. Ceiling at 2,000 feet. Visibility marginal. Temperature just above freezing. General William Kepner, commander of 8th Fighter Command, arrived with 3 other senior officers and stood on the edge of the airfield with his hands in his coat pockets and said nothing. His expression said everything. He had seen demonstrations before. He had seen aircraft that performed beautifully at an air show and came apart in combat. He was prepared to be unimpressed. The pilots chosen for the demonstration were not the group's best. They were deliberately chosen as average to show what an ordinary trained pilot could do in this aircraft, not what a specialist could do on his best day. That decision would prove to be either very smart or very dangerous, and no one knew which until it happened. At 0900, the first P-51B rolled onto the runway. The Merlin engine at full power produced a sound that was different from the Thunderbolt, higher and sharper, almost impatient. It was off the ground in less than 400 feet. It climbed at a rate that made one of the observers involuntarily step forward, as if he needed a better angle to confirm what he was seeing. The aircraft reached 15,000 feet in under 6 minutes. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the aircraft it was supposed to replace on escort duty, needed nearly 9. At 25,000 feet, the pilot pushed the throttle to military power and held it there. The airspeed indicator climbed past 400 miles per hour. A Focke-Wulf 190 at that altitude topped out at approximately 390. Kepner was no longer standing with his hands in his pockets. He was standing with a clipboard and he was writing. The second demonstration was the range calculation, not simulated range. Actual fuel burn data confirmed against 3 previous test flights showing that a P-51B with drop tanks could fly from the airfields of East Anglia to Berlin, fight over the target for 20 minutes, and return with fuel to spare. One of the senior officers shook his head when the number was read aloud. Not in disbelief. In something that looked more like grief, because the number meant that this had been possible for months, and the men who had died in the gap of death had died while this aircraft existed. Nobody said that out loud. The math said it for them. Kepner closed his clipboard. He looked at the aircraft sitting on the runway with its engine still running, and he said 4 words that ended the argument. Order everything we have. Production of the P-51B was already ramping at North American's Dallas and Inglewood facilities, but Arnold's priority order unleashed it completely. 1,300 Mustangs were ordered immediately. The pipeline that had been a trickle became a flood. Moving 1,300 aircraft from factories in California and Texas to airfields in England was one problem. Converting pilots who had trained on the Thunderbolt and trusted it with their lives was a different problem, and in some ways the more stubborn one. The P-51 flew differently. Its controls were lighter, more sensitive. Pilots who overcorrected on the Thunderbolt and got away with it found that the same inputs in the Mustang produced consequences. 3 pilots at the 354th Fighter Group ground-looped on landing during their first week of conversion training. 2 more had close calls in formation. Veterans who had survived 50 missions did not enjoy feeling like beginners, and some of them said so without much courtesy. One squadron commander sent a written complaint up the chain, stating that his men were experienced combat pilots being asked to relearn how to fly by people who had never been shot at. The complaint was read, acknowledged, and filed. The conversion training continued. What changed the mood was not another briefing. It was a single combat report from December 13, 1943. The 354th Fighter Group flying P-51Bs had escorted bombers to Kiel farther than any previous escort mission and had encountered Luftwaffe interception. They had not turned back. They had fought. They had downed 8 German fighters and returned with all their bombers. The loss rate on that mission was a fraction of the average. When that report circulated, the written complaints stopped. Pilots who had been skeptical began requesting transfer to Mustang groups. The aircraft that had been dismissed as a dead end was suddenly the most requested posting in the 8th Air Force. German intelligence received the first reports of long-range P-51 escorts in January of 1944. The initial assessment filed by Luftwaffe intelligence to senior command described the sightings as likely misidentification. The analysts believed the Americans were using modified drop tanks to extend P-47 range. They did not believe a single-engine fighter could operate effectively that far into Germany. They were wrong, and the cost of being wrong was already accelerating. But the Germans were not sitting still. By February of 1944, word had reached the highest levels of German command that something fundamental had changed in the air war, and a response was being prepared, one that would test the Mustang and its pilots in ways the December escort to Kiel had not even approximated. Operation Argument was coming. The Americans were about to send every bomber they had, every fighter they could put in the sky into the heart of Germany in a single week. Big Week, the men would call it later. And the Luftwaffe, finally understanding what they were facing, was preparing to throw everything they had left at stopping it. The gap of death was closing. But the war was not over. In Part 3, the Mustang meets the full force of the Luftwaffe for the first time, and what happens over Germany in February of 1944 will determine whether everything that came before was enough. In Parts 1 and 2, a single memo from a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronnie Harker set in motion a chain of events that transformed a dismissed reconnaissance aircraft into the most dangerous fighter in the sky. Engineers forced a Merlin engine into the P-51 Mustang. The result shocked everyone who saw it fly. General Arnold ordered full production. 1,300 aircraft flooded into England. The 354th Fighter Group escorted bombers to Kiel and brought them home. The gap of death had a new answer. But in January of 1944, German intelligence finally understood what it was looking at. And when the Luftwaffe High Command read the reports coming out of their own radar stations and survivor debriefs, what followed was not calm analysis. It was panic dressed in the language of emergency planning. General Adolf Galland received the intelligence summary on a Tuesday morning. He read it once, set it down, and read it again. The report was straightforward. American single-engine fighters had been identified operating over Bremen over Hamburg at altitudes and ranges that were previously considered physically impossible for their aircraft type. Galland was not a man who frightened easily. He had over 100 aerial victories. He had flown since Spain. He understood fighter performance at a level most of his superiors did not, and what the report described should not have existed. He called an emergency meeting of his senior commanders and said something that none of them wanted to hear. They have solved the range problem. We do not yet know how. But the gap we relied on is gone, and we must assume it is gone permanently. The room was quiet, in the way rooms go quiet when everyone understands that the assumptions the entire strategy was built on have just collapsed. The Luftwaffe's response came in three directions simultaneously. First, they pushed development of the Focke-Wulf 190D, a longer-nosed, more powerful variant, designed to restore altitude performance against whatever the Americans were flying. Second, they accelerated production of the Me-262 jet fighter program, which had been moving slowly through bureaucratic obstruction for 2 years. Third, and most immediately, they changed their interception tactics. Instead of waiting at altitude for the escorts to leave, German controllers began ordering their fighters to engage the escorts directly to attrite the Mustangs before they could establish dominance over the bomber stream. It was a logical response. It was also exactly the wrong one, because it meant German pilots were now fighting on American terms at altitudes and ranges where the Mustang held every advantage. Luftwaffe loss rates, which had averaged around 30 aircraft per major American mission in 1943, jumped to 67 per mission in February of 1944. The men being lost were not replaceable. But the tactical shift also created a new problem no one had anticipated, and it came from inside the American command structure rather than from the enemy. General Frederick Anderson, commanding the 8th Bomber Command, wanted the Mustangs tied to the bombers. Escort doctrine, as it had always been understood, meant the fighters stayed with the formation. They flew in assigned positions. They did not chase. They did not roam. They protected the aircraft they were assigned to protect, and they did it by staying close. It was the doctrine that made sense when escorts were limited and every loss hurt. Jimmy Doolittle, who had taken command of the 8th Air Force in January, looked at that doctrine and saw a mistake dressed as caution. He and Anderson argued about it in terms that the official record describes diplomatically, and that the actual participants described considerably less so. Anderson believed that breaking the escorts loose from the bombers would expose the formations to exactly the kind of coordinated interception that had been killing crews since 1942. Doolittle believed that keeping the escorts passive handed the Luftwaffe a gift they did not deserve. The argument came to a head in late January, when a mission to Frankfurt lost 11 bombers despite a full escort complement. The escorts had stayed close. The German fighters had found angles and altitude the close escort formation could not cover. 11 aircraft, 110 men. Doolittle made his decision. He issued a new order, and it was brief enough to memorize. Fighter pilots were to pursue and destroy the enemy wherever they found him. The bombers were the priority, but the mission was air superiority. And air superiority meant hunting. Anderson filed a formal objection. Doolittle acknowledged it and implemented the new doctrine anyway. 3 senior pilots at the 4th Fighter Group heard the order and could not quite believe it was real. One of them, a 23-year-old from Massachusetts named Don Gentile, reportedly read it twice and then looked at his wingman and said, "He's letting us go." That simple phrase captured everything. The Mustangs were no longer a shield. They were a blade. And the first real test of what that meant came 11 days later in the skies over central Germany, during the week that American airmen would spend the rest of their lives talking about. February 20th, 1944. Big week begins before dawn. At airfields across East Anglia, nearly 1,000 American bombers are running their engines in the dark. The mission is the German aircraft industry factories at Leipzig, Brunswick. Regensburg targets that have been on the target list since 1942, but were never reachable without acceptable losses. Today is different. Today, the escorts go all the way. The Mustangs of the 354th, the 357th, and the 4th Fighter Groups climb into a pale gray morning sky and form up above the clouds. Don Gentile is flying. Above 25,000 feet, the temperature outside is minus 55 degrees Fahrenheit. At 0930 hours, the German radar net picks up the formation, and the controllers begin vectoring their interceptors. What they expect is what always happens. A wall of bombers, escorts peeling off at the frontier, the gap opening, the hunting beginning. What they get is something else entirely. The Mustangs do not peel off. They climb. They accelerate. And they are already moving when the first German formation rises to meet them over Leipzig at 0947-48. Focke-Wulf 190s in 2 staggered waves climbing to attack altitude, organizing for the coordinated head-on pass that had shredded bomber formations for 2 years. They never get organized. Gentile sees them first. He calls the brake and pushes his throttle forward. The Merlin responds instantly. The P-51 covers the altitude gap in under 90 seconds. The Germans are still climbing, still forming. They have not finished their turn when the Mustangs hit them. The formation breaks apart. Not tactically, physically. Aircraft scatter in every direction as the Americans tear through the middle of the German formation at over 400 miles per hour. 3 Focke-Wulfs are burning before the German flight leaders have time to transmit a warning. The fight that follows is not a dogfight in the classic sense. It is a pursuit. German pilots brake and dive trying to reach lower altitude, where the Mustang's laminar wing loses some of its efficiency advantage. The Mustangs follow. At 10,000 feet, a P-51 is still faster than a Focke-Wulf 190 in a straight line. The dive doesn't save anyone. By 10:15 hours, the German formation that rose to defend Leipzig has ceased to exist as a fighting unit. 19 aircraft destroyed, 4 pilots recovered, 15 dead over their own city. The bombers hit the Erle Maschinenwerk factory at Leipzig at 10:22 hours. The bomb run lasts 4 minutes. The factory, which produces Me-109 fighter components, takes direct hits across 3 production buildings. Output falls by 60% and does not recover for 2 months. Over the next 4 days, the pattern repeats across Germany. The Mustangs do not wait for the Germans to organize. They find them on the ground. They find them climbing. They find them in the landing pattern when fuel is low and options are gone. On February 22nd, Gentile personally destroys 4 German aircraft in a single mission. On February 24th, the 357th Fighter Group engages a formation of Me-110 heavy fighters over Schweinfurt and destroys 11 of them without losing a single aircraft. By the end of Big Week, the Luftwaffe has lost 260 aircraft and, more critically, 198 experienced pilots. Not wounded. Dead. The production losses are serious. The pilot losses are terminal. Gentile's combat report from February 20th, filed that evening in language that tried to be clinical and did not quite succeed, contained one line that circulated through the command structure faster than any official summary. He wrote, "They did not expect us to stay. When we stayed, they did not know what to do." That sentence described the entire strategic shift in 11 words. The Luftwaffe had built its interception doctrine around the certainty of the gap. The gap was gone. The doctrine was useless, and the men who had mastered that doctrine were dying at a rate that no training pipeline could address. In March of 1944, the Luftwaffe graduated 412 new fighter pilots from its training schools. In the same month, it lost 531. The math required no interpretation. By the time March 6th arrived, and 700 American bombers flew toward Berlin with Mustang escorts reaching all the way to the target and back, the outcome of the air war had already been decided in the ledger books of attrition. The mission to Berlin on March 6th cost 69 bombers and 690 men. It was a terrible price. It was also the last day the Luftwaffe was able to contest American air supremacy at scale. 72 German fighters were destroyed. 39 of the pilots killed were veterans with more than 20 victories each. Men who had been flying since 1939. Men who had survived the Battle of Britain, the Eastern Front, North Africa. Gone in a single afternoon over their own capital. What followed March 6th was not victory. It was acceleration. The Mustang groups were given latitude they had never had before. They dropped down to treetop level after the bombing runs and hunted anything that moved. Airfields that had been safe became killing grounds. Parked aircraft burned on the tarmac. Fuel trucks exploded at the pump. Ground crews died running for cover. The Luftwaffe began dispersing its aircraft to small fields hidden in forests, a defensive measure that reduced their ability to concentrate force at the moments that mattered most. By April of 1944, American bomber loss rates had fallen from a catastrophic 7% per mission in late 1943 to under 2%. That number 2% meant that a crew flying 25 missions now had a statistical probability of survival. Not a certainty, but a genuine probability. For the men who had done the math in 1943 and arrived at conclusions they didn't share with anyone, 2% was the difference between a death sentence and a fighting chance. The transformation did not happen because of a single genius or a single decision. It happened because Harker wrote a memo, because engineers worked through the night, because Hitchcock wrote the right letters to the right people, because Doolittle trusted the doctrine and changed it when it stopped working, because Gentile and hundreds of pilots like him flew until they were empty and then flew again. The Mustang was the instrument. The men were the music. But the man who had started it all, the test pilot, who had written 3 sentences on a single page in April of 1942, was not standing in any victory photograph. He had gone back to testing aircraft. His contribution had been absorbed into history and was already being forgotten by the institutions that had most benefited from it. And what happened next, the final chapter of the P-51 story and the story of the men who built it and flew it, is something that almost no one remembers correctly. In Part 4, we find out what the Mustang's legacy actually cost, who paid for it, and what the aircraft that won the air war over Europe tells us about how innovation actually works when the stakes are absolute. From a single memo written by a Rolls-Royce test pilot to full-scale air superiority over Germany, the P-51 Mustang's journey covered 4 years, 2 continents, and a transformation that no one in authority had believed was possible. Harker wrote 3 sentences. Engineers worked through the night. Doolittle changed the doctrine. Gentile and 500 pilots like him hunted the Luftwaffe until it could no longer fly. By the spring of 1944, the air war over Europe had been decided. But the cliffhanger from Part 3 still stands unanswered. What happened to the men behind the machine? What happened to Ronnie Harker, the man who started all of it with a memo that fit on 1 page? The answer is not what you expect, because this story has one final twist, and it says more about how the world actually works than any battle report ever could. Ronnie Harker did not receive a medal. He did not receive a promotion. When the war ended in May of 1945, he was still working as a test pilot for Rolls-Royce flying experimental aircraft, writing reports that went to people above him in a hierarchy that had largely absorbed his contribution without attaching his name to it. He was 33 years old. He was alive, which was more than many of the men who had benefited from his memo could say. He returned to his family in England and continued flying for Rolls-Royce through the late 1940s, testing the jet engines that were already making the piston engine world he had worked in irrelevant. He was good at his job. He was respected by the people who worked alongside him. He was unknown to everyone else. The official histories of the P-51 Mustang program, written in the years immediately after the war, mentioned him briefly in footnotes, if at all. The men who received credit were the generals who had approved the program, the executives who had signed the contracts, and the test pilots who had broken records in the finished aircraft. Harker, who had seen the potential in the airframe before anyone else was looking, who had written the document that set the entire transformation in motion, existed in the margins of the story he had made possible. Thomas Hitchcock, the young attaché who had stood up in a room full of generals and said what no one with rank was willing to say, did not live to see how completely he had been right. He died in April of 1944 in a crash during a routine test flight in England 3 months before D-Day, 2 months after Big Week had proved every argument he had made. He was 44 years old. His obituary mentioned that he had been a polo champion between the wars. It did not mention the letters he had written, or the briefing he had survived, or the generals he had refused to stop pushing. The men who had told him his enthusiasm was not a logistics plan outlived him. The strategy he had fought for changed the war. He never knew the final score. Don Gentile, the pilot who had described Doolittle's new doctrine in 11 words, and then gone out and lived it every day over Germany, returned to the United States as a genuine hero, the kind the newspapers wanted photographs of. He had 30 aerial victories, making him the top American ace in the European theater at that point in the war. He was given a ticker tape parade. He was photographed with General Eisenhower. He left the military, struggled to find a place in a peacetime world that was moving very fast toward things he had not been trained for, and died in a training accident in 1951 at the age of 30. The Mustang had kept him alive over Germany. It could not keep him alive in the years after. The aircraft itself outlasted all of them, and what it did after the war ended is one of the most underappreciated stories in the history of military aviation. When the guns went silent in Europe, the United States Army Air Forces had 15,000 P-51 Mustangs in various stages of production and deployment. Most of them were sold, transferred, or scrapped within 2 years. 45 nations flew the Mustang after 1945. Israel flew it in the 1948 War of Independence. South Korea flew it through the entire Korean War, where P-51s flew more ground attack sorties than any other aircraft in the conflict. The Swedish Air Force flew Mustangs until 1954. The Dominican Republic flew them until 1984. 40 years after the first Merlin-powered prototype lifted off from a field in England, aircraft built from the same design were still in operational service somewhere in the world. The laminar flow wing that had given the Mustang its extraordinary efficiency influenced the design of civilian aircraft for decades, its principles appearing in everything from executive transports to high-altitude research aircraft. The supercharger technology developed for the Merlin engine and refined for the Mustang program fed directly into the development of early turbojet and turbofan systems, meaning that the engineering work done in English workshops in 1942 has a legitimate lineage that connects to the engines powering commercial aircraft today. Total production of all P-51 variants reached 15,875 aircraft. Those aircraft flew an estimated 2 million combat hours, escorted more than 200,000 bomber sorties, and were credited with destroying nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft in the air and 4,500 on the ground. Statistical analysis of the bomber loss rate reduction attributable to long-range escort suggests that the Mustang program, from the moment the first Merlin-powered aircraft entered combat to the end of the war, saved approximately 18,000 American airmen, who would otherwise have died in the gap of death. 18,000 men who came home. 18,000 families that were not destroyed. That number is Harker's memo measured in human lives. But the largest lesson from the P-51 story is not technical, and it is not even military. It is institutional. Every organization that existed in 1942 and 1943 had good reasons to say no to the Merlin conversion. The procurement officers had budget constraints and logistics concerns that were real and legitimate. The senior commanders had doctrines they had built careers defending and experience they trusted. The engineers who listed the technical obstacles were not wrong about the obstacles. The reasons to refuse were sound. The decision to refuse was catastrophic. What the Mustang story demonstrates with a clarity that is uncomfortable for any large institution to sit with is that the people most invested in a current strategy are the least capable of evaluating the alternative. Hansel was not stupid. He was too successful at being right about the things he already believed. The men who saved the bomber campaign were not the ones who had built it. They were the ones who looked at what was failing and refused to accept that failure was the only option. This pattern does not belong only to the Second World War. The development of the transistor was rejected internally by Bell Labs managers before the engineers pushed it through anyway. The Internet's early architecture was dismissed by major telecommunications executives as impractical. GPS was opposed by multiple branches of the American military before it became so essential that no military in the world would operate without it. In every case, the people with the most authority had the most to lose from being wrong, and therefore the strongest incentive to believe they were right. In every case, the people who changed things were working against institutional gravity, not with it. The Mustang did not win because the system worked. It won because a small number of people refused to let the system finish saying no. There is one detail about the P-51 Mustang program that is almost never included in the popular accounts. A detail that only came to light through declassified intelligence files released in the 1990s. And it reframes the entire story in a way that makes the German failure even more precise and therefore more instructive. German intelligence, it turns out, had received credible reports about the Merlin conversion as early as mid-1943. A technical intelligence summary prepared for Luftwaffe High Command in October of that year, 3 months before Big Week. 3 months before the escort started staying all the way to the target, accurately described the performance improvements the Merlin engine would give the Mustang at altitude. The summary was filed, it was reviewed, and the senior Luftwaffe officer responsible for evaluating American fighter capabilities attached a single handwritten note to the bottom of the report before sending it up the chain. The note read in translation, "Range claims appear exaggerated. Recommend monitoring." Recommend monitoring. The gap of death that German strategy depended on was already closing. The intelligence was on the desk. The analysis was correct. And the officer responsible for acting on it looked at information that contradicted what he believed and decided to wait for more evidence. By the time more evidence arrived, it was arriving in the form of P-51s over Berlin. The Germans did not lose the air war because they lacked information. They lost it because the information contradicted the world they had decided to live in, and choosing comfort over accuracy is a decision that history charges full price for always. From a Rolls-Royce test pilot's 3 sentences in April of 1942 to air superiority over Germany by the spring of 1944 to 18,000 airmen who came home because a fighter existed that should not have been possible. This is the complete account of what the P-51 Mustang actually was and why it mattered. Harker never received the recognition that belongs to him, and the men who fought over Germany never stopped knowing at a level beneath words that someone they never met had looked at a struggling aircraft and seen something everyone else had missed. The war was not shortened by a general's brilliant strategy. It was shortened because a test pilot trusted what he felt in his hands at 15,000 feet, wrote it down honestly, and sent it to people who eventually listened. If you know a story like this one, a moment where someone ordinary saw what everyone else refused to see and pushed until the world changed, share it in the comments below. These are not rare moments in history. They are the moments history is made of, and they deserve to be told. Subscribe and stay with us, because the next story we have for you involves a decision made in 48 hours that altered the outcome of the Pacific War, and the man who made it was not supposed to be in the room at all. The P-51 Mustang proved one thing above every other: the most dangerous weapon in any war is not the one with the most firepower. It is the one that exists because someone refused to accept that it couldn't.